All right, as folks are still trickling in, I think we'll get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm Andrew Lautz, Director of Federal Policy at National Taxpayers Union. With me is Jonathan Bydlak at R Street Institute, Mandy Smithberger at Project on Government Oversight, and our special guest today for the fifth episode in our Pentagon Purse Strings series, Senator Mike Braun of Indiana. Mike Braun has represented Indiana in the U.S. Senate since January 2019. Before his election to the Senate in 2018, he was founder and CEO of Meyer Distributing, a company he built in his hometown of Jasper that employs hundreds of Americans across the country. Senator Braun has emerged as a leader on budget, debt, and deficit matters in the Senate and has also sponsored several good government measures aimed at making the defense budget more accountable to taxpayers. He serves on the Budget and Appropriations committees in the Senate, as well as the Agriculture, Aging, and Health, Education, Labor, and Pension committees. Lastly, I'll note that Senator Braun is one of only 4 U.S. senators to have received a Taxpayers Friend Award from National Taxpayers Union in 2020, a distinction that speaks to Senator Braun's commitment to fiscal responsibility and pro-taxpayer policies. Senator Braun, thanks for joining us today. And by the way, congratulations on winning another Taxpayers Friend Award from NTU, your second in 2 years in the U.S. Senate.
A badge of honor, I can say that.
Thanks, Senator. Let's get started. The topic of today is President Biden's budget proposal, but we also want to go through budget issues generally, the debt and deficit. But first, I'd love to get your general reaction to the broad outlines of President Biden's budget proposal released last month.
So I was wrestling last night on the floor. If you want some good entertainment, it went up to, I think, 25 minutes with our new budget chair, Bernie Sanders. And it was on that idea of modern monetary theory. I won't get diverted on that topic, but it would be emblematic of what is, I think, driving the focus of President Biden, Democrats in general. So his budget is one that, coming from the context, I was a CFO of my business for 37 years, as well as CEO. And that's because it was so small for so long, you had to do it all. I was a finance guy with an economics degree, finance focus in business school, economics degree, and finally macroeconomics and Keynesian discussion and Milton Friedman all came out on the U.S. Senate floor. In general, when you are thinking that large through the federal government in the budget, and you have no kind of real justification of how you do this sustainably over time. In my little under 2.5 years here, the whole budget system is full of gimmicks. Any pay-fors are in years 6 through 10. I wish I could do that, in building a business over the years. Any discipline put into the system quickly gets unraveled by the real ingenuity of this place, and it's how to live beyond its means. Hasn't done a budget. That's why I don't even want to call President Biden's thing a budget. It is a wish list. It's aspirational, that has no ability other than to put us into more peril down the road. Time I've been here, even to my conservative friends, I think we've evolved because of the unholy alliance that exists between most Republicans. I'm one of them that believes defense is the most important thing we do. But even the most important thing or two in my business over the years, I would never hold it sacrosanct. I would put it under the same scrutiny and rigor as the things maybe less important, not interested in. Well, 2/3 of what we spend here, you can't even touch because it's on autopilot, mandatory spending. Again, career politicians, that is their kind of pinnacle of being here by not having to look at Social Security, Medicare. Actuarially, we knew it was coming. It's 2/3 of our structural annual deficits, and everybody puts their head in the sand. So President Biden's budget, to me, is an embarrassment and an atrocity in the sense that it's built upon $20 trillion in debt that we accumulated, not fighting a war, but by consuming and spending. The wars in The Middle East, yes, under the Bush administration. And then since the Obama administration, sadly, Republicans throwing in on the feeding frenzy. We've got what we've got. You get an outlier like COVID coming along, that generally should be done out of emergency funds, rainy day funds, like we do in a place like Indiana. Nope, let's borrow it from our kids and grandkids. So I think that sets us up for a crisis, a series of crises, and a solution by calamity, which no one would ever run the biggest business in the world, especially the federal government, 10 times the size of, I always describe it as Walmart, buildings, people, moving parts. There you got the rigor of the marketplace. You earn your revenues. My cohorts out here can't take $4.5 trillion a year and figure out how not to spend more than what's given to you. I think you know where I'm coming from.
For sure. Thank you, Senator, for being here. Really appreciate your time. I think you raise a good point that our spending problem and sort of budgetary issues have been very much bipartisanly caused, and so I think it's important that we have solutions that will sort of address it regardless of who's in power. And I know to that end, you've introduced an effort, recently reintroduced an effort, the Maximizing America's Prosperity Act. And I wonder if you could, talk to our viewers a little bit about that legislation and how you think it might impact taxpayers and maybe the Pentagon specifically.
So that's a very simple concept because regardless of our tax rate, if it's high, you're going to you're not going to generate any more revenue. That's the fallacy, I think, of the Democrats. They think you can raise taxes without having any economic growth offset. We hit kind of the sweet spot in my mind. The whole corporate tax rate is a little dicey and tricky because so many of the huge C corps lower their rate by being multinational. And then you got to argue, well, where should you be in the competition of world economies and taxation? But in general, over 50 years, regardless of that rate, it generates about 17.5% of our GDP. We've now become spenders closer to 19 to 20%. And I'm saying work it down with some type of guideline over time. The only time you can actually maybe get out of that framework is the way fiscal policy should work when you're trying to offset a downturn. But put that straight jacket, which is really what we need because the place is run like an insane asylum here when it comes to spending, out there. Sadly, with sequestration, budget caps, whenever we do that, we shed it because there's no political will here. Until there's a balanced budget amendment and or term limits, you're going to solve this not through my bill, which would make sense. You're going to solve it through completely depleting the Medicare trust fund in 5.5 years. Or when the world doesn't view us as a reserve currency, interest rates go up more than a few basis points. They go up 1, 2, 3% overnight. That's the crisis. That's the calamity. And sadly, I think that's when we come back into reality.
No, totally agree. And Senator, as a member of an organization that supports the MAP Act, just want to reiterate and thank you for reintroducing that. Though our organizations care about all aspects of the federal budget, this is, of course, a webinar where we primarily focus and talk about the defense budget. Now, Senator, as you indicated earlier, you have proven yourself as more than willing to take a hard look at where DoD may be wasting taxpayer dollars or spending them less than efficiently. Can you talk about these efforts broadly and why it's important for even defense hawks such as yourself to scrutinize the Pentagon budget?
Because when the most important thing you like that you can't put your principles towards, that is symptomatic of what ails the system. I said that earlier. I lose fiscal conservatives like Rick Scott, Ron Johnson. They, for whatever reason, don't view it like I would. Rand Paul and Mike Lee for maybe a little different reason. I'm more of a pragmatist in terms of just liking things to work out, maybe not taking a more theoretical or ethereal approach to how things work in the long run. And then just recently, John Kennedy from Louisiana surprised me. I noticed he voted against the NDAA. I said, John, did you have an issue where you weren't getting something you wanted for defense? He said, no, Mike, I think you're on to something. I think we got to look at our budget issues more broadly. And I love that because that's at least one more. I wish guys like Rick Scott, Ron Johnson, others that put defense on a pinnacle would then have the kind of discipline to hold it accountable as well.
For sure. And oh, sorry, Jonathan. I just want to add one note before turning to you. It's I think a reason, Senator, why you and Senator Kennedy were two of our 4 Taxpayer Friend Award winners. It's part of that, of course, factors into the defense budget and where we're seeing waste and some of the better amendments introduced to improve the DoD budget. So we hope to give some of your colleagues some of these awards in the future, and if they join you in those defense efforts, I think they'll have a better shot.
Well, we're expanded our numbers, by 33% this year with John coming on board. So,
well, I think that's great, and I applaud the consistency, and I think the intellectual honesty. I think that you're right that there are a lot of people who are fiscally conservative about programs they don't like, and then they sort of discard those principles for programs that they do. And I think that for those of us who are sort of doing this for a living and sort of really trying to be to make positive policy progress, it's really helpful to have people like yourself who are willing to sort of be consistent across the board, even for things that you may support, because the reality is there's waste, there are things that we maybe shouldn't be spending on or should at least be reconsidering in all government departments and programs. But you mentioned the NDAA specifically, which is of course coming up, the next annual defense policy bill. And so I wonder if maybe you could give our listeners a little bit of a preview about what that might look like, what priorities you're considering for the legislation, and sort of what how you're expecting that to go.
So when it comes to what's within that, I'm going to be mostly focused on the number again. And in the Biden budget, you can see that they're taking domestic considerations and aspirations off the chart. They're doing so much of it based upon a crisis mentality. We've already have done 1.9 trillion for the rescue plan. Got the Jobs Infrastructure Act out there, 2.5 trillion. Family plan, 1.5 trillion. I mean, we throw trillions around like billions were just a few years ago. So I think here, what I would be looking for is, am I going to see a dynamic shift? Because this is not going to be a whole lot different than it was when we were in charge of the purse strings. I think Trump did the right thing and maybe bringing back defense, because I think it was emaciated to a degree with what Obama did. But then I didn't see the discipline once you brought it kind of back into general line. And that's where I saw the unholy alliance take over. So I'll be in the same spot I was over the last rounds where I voted against it for the same reason, because this is even in a worse context. Because of the balance sheet, it's going to have close to 30 trillion in debt. So I probably won't even get into the details of what you might do. I'm going to be harping on, I think, the most important issue is that where are we going to ever, even though defense and domestic discretionary spending, both of them are about 1/6 of our budget each. 1/3 is discretionary, 2/3 is on autopilot. And did you see anything in Biden's proposal that wants to talk about Social Security or Medicare? If you reform Medicare along the lines of fixing a broken industry out there, which is what healthcare is, building my business, full competition, no barriers to entry, full transparency, an engaged consumer, the 4 hallmarks of anything that works. Healthcare is like an unregulated utility, but my side of the aisle thinks it's free enterprise. The other side wants the Bernie Sanders plan. That is the problem with the federal government in a very kind of metaphorical description, but I know it hits it on the mark. So I'm going to keep doing what I do, because when you do vote against defense, when you say it's the most important thing, that you think the federal government should do, maybe infrastructure next, entitlement reform third, it brings you into the conversation. They said, well, why did you do that? Well, that's why.
For sure, and I want to. You mentioned debt, so I sort of want to zoom out for a minute and talk about the debt. I think when we start talking about $30 trillion, certainly households, as you mentioned, Senator, households need to balance their budgets, businesses need to balance their budgets. I think most folks understand that, but even to people who are steeped in the policy every day, like those of us here, you start talking about 28 trillion, 30 trillion, it starts to get so abstract. Can you share just sort of your perspective on why the historic level of debt and our historic deficits matter?
I've gotten real good at making it less abstract, even though it is an abstract subject. So let's go back to World War II. We paid for, fought along with our allies, the biggest battle, I think, in human history. And we were the deepest in debt coming out of World War II. Big difference. We were savers and investors then. We are consumers and spenders now. And that is indicative of where we're at in total debt. And if you want to read a good book, it's The Empire of Debt. Mike Enzi gave it to me shortly before he was leaving here as the loneliest chair in the U.S. Senate of the Budget Committee. And it's a great read. It makes humor out of a dismal subject and gives the historical context of where that's never worked. It always ends up bad. We are not going to pay this debt down. We are doubling down now with the modern monetary theory, exactly what I was wrestling with Bernie Sanders on. And if you want to see a guy that epitomizes using anything, including modern monetary theory, but mostly, I don't care. I want to do it through government, regardless of how much it costs. That is driving the scene here. Republicans are part of the unholy alliance, I think, until maybe now. Even some of the folks that have been here can see there's a difference between 20 and 30 trillion, 50% increase when it happens over 2.5 years, the time I've been here. So still maybe.
I know we're getting a little short on your time, so I want to ask, I guess, the last question, which is really a multi-part question, which is, let's assume for a second that you could kind of wave the magic wand and implement any reform to the federal budgetary process that you could. What might that be? And I think we could ask the other question, which is, with respect to the defense budget specifically, are there reforms there that you might wave the wand on? And I guess the flip side question too is are there in a practical sense, given the current political situation that we're in, are there any areas where you think there might be the ability to work with the current administration or just generally pick off some low-hanging fruit?
Let's talk about the second one first, and the magic wand we'll end up with. So I've been talking to some Democrats because the biggest driver of the budget is Medicare. Social Security actually has got another 13 years, and we've known that actuarially for decades that it's going to be depleted. But the healthcare industry is only eclipsed by higher education now, but not by much. There's 1.7 trillion of student debt out there. Healthcare is where 20% of our economy, it's the biggest part of our economy. Everywhere else, it's 10 to 12%. We've got some value added in what we do here. Pharma does a great job until they try to sell the pill. They R&D it and come up with, and it's only 15% roughly of the healthcare bill. Then they've got this abomination of a PBM where you were so derelict in how you sell it and distribute it, you give it to a middleman. I've never heard of a middleman being created. A lot of room to get that down, maybe not to 10 to 12. I don't think you need to go there. Maybe 14 to 15%. All of a sudden, that frees up a pretty good hunk. And if we would then take it and not spend it, that'd be my big fear there. So I think healthcare, and I explained to Democrats, don't you want to reform add transparency, get rid of the barriers to entry, get a healthcare consumer engaged through basic transparency. This will be a subject for another discussion. I did it in my own business 13 years ago. $1 involvement with my employees. I make sure they don't go broke because they get sick or have a bad accident. Cut costs 50%. And I've not had a premium increase in 13 years. I asked my son, how we doing? We've only gone up in our costs per employee 1% a year over 13 years. That could work. That's the only place I see commonality to where we could get savings without having to wave the magic wand or run it into the ditch, solve it through crisis. If you could wave the magic wand, you got to go back to what any household, local or state government, school board would do: freeze or restrict your increases to something that's defined. No one anywhere would know if you're missing one of 100 of this or that. You just do it like Rand Paul's had the penny plan. And that penny plan is not to go up a penny a year, but to go down a penny a year. That would be a chip shot for any smart CEO. Or when I had to go through 08, 09, we immediately, even though we were low overhead to begin with, found another 5 to 10%. But it's got to be something that you cannot slough off. You cannot, like sequestration and caps, have a moment where you're there. And remember, you can undo everything here. Term limits politically would solve it. There aren't many people here I'd hire to run a lemonade stand, to be honest, that have never done a budget. And they're all smart, but they're mostly lawyers that have gotten into politics early on and given us what we've got. You'd have to have that discipline. The arithmetic is beautiful in terms of what you do. If you'd freeze or go down 1% a year, you could get back into balance, even with our ugly balance sheet. Probably a pipe dream. I still think that it's going to be a hard entry into the ditch that wakes up my cohorts out here. And who knows, we might be 40 trillion in debt by then.
Whew. Well, let's hope not. But Senator, really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much. And thank you for your work on behalf of taxpayers. We look forward to chatting with you again soon. Enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you, Senator. And we'll now transition to the next part of our webinar with Mandy Smithberger from the Project on Government Oversight. Mandy joined POGO as the Director of the Center for Defense Information in December 2014. Previously, she was a National Security Policy Advisor to U.S. Representative Jackie Speer of California. There, she worked on passing key provisions of the Military Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act into law. Mandy is an expert on national security, Pentagon reform, and the defense industry revolving door. I'll also note that Mandy testified before one of Senator Braun's committees, the Senate Budget Committee, just yesterday on Pentagon waste, fraud, and cost overruns. So she has had a very busy week, and we appreciate her making time for us this morning. Mandy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. First off, I figured we'd kick it off. You've been listening into the conversation here with Senator Braun. Any thoughts or reactions to what he shared with us?
I will say on the term limits issue, and this will not make me popular, one of the things that I always worry about with term limits is that we are then really empowering the executive branch to be that much more powerful over Congress. And I know that a number of our organizations have been working on and expanding Congress's capacity to conduct oversight. So I think there are other areas where we do need to make sure that we're not just being institutionalized to kind of protect the status quo because it is the status quo. But I also would agree with Senator Braun that I think healthcare is an arena that we need to have more accountability on both sides of the aisle as well, though that's not my area of expertise.
No, for sure. And it's, I'll say, just in immediate reaction to the conversation, it is refreshing to hear, particularly Republican lawmakers, although there are lawmakers on both sides of the aisle who I think all of us would agree are often a little too cautious or a little too hesitant to take on waste in the Pentagon budget. And I think Senator Braun hopefully our listeners could tell from that conversation too, is seems committed to really taking a closer look. Let's turn to the Biden defense budget request though, because this is your area of expertise, Mandy. Can you sort of catch some of our listeners up to the broad details that we know about the Biden defense budget request right now?
Absolutely. So as Senator Braun mentioned, the Department of Defense budget request largely looks pretty similar to what we were seeing under the Trump administration. It's, relatively flat, a slight increase. And I think Senator Braun made some really helpful comments about how it was, at least as a business, when he had caps that were actually caps instead of continuing to be added onto over each year, that it drove innovation. It drove ideas for where can we reduce costs, where can we make sure that we're being more effective. And so one of my concerns is by continuing to have the status quo with the Department of Defense budget, we're really telling them, even though we've, just yesterday in the Senate budget, we're talking about, the department can't pass an audit. There's all this waste. We're paying too much for spare parts, but you just keep doing keep on going and really don't worry about any kind of accountability. That said, it was really exciting that one of the things that's being proposed is getting rid of the Overseas Contingency Operations account, which was the war slush fund that the department and Congress were using repeatedly to keep on increasing the budget, to keep on funding things that normally wouldn't have made the budget. So I think there are some encouraging signs there, but we're already seeing additional press reports that we might already be talking about getting rid of the F-22, which is a system that we've only recently purchased. We're likely to buy at least 85 F-35s, even though there have been hearings over the past couple of weeks that we're really struggling with how to maintain that equipment. So I think we're seeing in many ways that there's not sufficient kind of reform and change happening to make us safer.
Thanks, Mandy. I think that's really helpful. Thanks for being here. I guess on that last point, why do you think that is? I think there are a lot of reasons that are proposed as to, why it's so hard maybe to have this progress. And there has been progress in certain areas, as you pointed out, right? The OCO, for example, now going away after years of our respective organizations and many others sort of advocating for it is, I think, a win, albeit a small one at this point. But I wonder what your thoughts are on why we struggle with this so much. Do you put the blame on Congress? Do you put the blame on the members or people at the Pentagon? Do you put the blame on the executive branch? What do you think really explains this phenomenon?
Yeah, I think honestly, President Eisenhower was right. And it's, everyone, right? It's the military, industrial, congressional complex and how that kind of corrupts the system. So where Pentagon spending is seen by both sides of the aisle as an area to be able to create jobs, even though we know that if we spent money in other areas that they're more productive job creators. I think that there are concerns that if you are challenging Pentagon spending, that you're not being patriotic, which I think is really unfortunate because what we've seen through recent investigations as to accidents that are happening here at home just in training, I think it's not patriotic to not hold the Department of Defense accountable because we're seeing preventable deaths occur because we're buying immature weapon systems that take money away from training, that take our money away from us being able to make sure that we are being effective as a country. And then so you certainly then have campaign contributions contributing to the problems as well, that in some ways our system is kind of set up to protect various agencies and industries where the people who have constituencies or contractors in their district that benefit from whatever agency budget, they're the ones who are sitting on those committees and overseeing the spending. So shockingly, we keep on seeing the spending increase as a result.
Sure, and I actually want to go back to another detail you mentioned about the Biden budget request, and Jonathan mentioned it too, and that's OCO. Mandy, well, you both know how much I care about OCO, and so I'm going to ask somewhat of a leading question. And it's okay if you disagree with what I think about this, but if is there more work to be done on OCO, even if Congress agrees with Biden and does it fund it this year, and why or why not?
Yes, I think there is. And I think we've already seen a commitment from the Department of Defense Comptroller nominee, Mike McCord, as well, that we need to make sure that we continue to have transparency measures, that we're still accounting for what is war spending. I think one of the problems with OCO and how it was used over the past 10 years is that it's difficult for us to have a very straightforward conversation about what is really the cost of going to war, what are the costs of these operations. And as Senator Braun was mentioning, what's really key to making everything work is having transparency and honesty and understanding our policy decisions and and the spending consequences.
Ooh, sorry, I couldn't get myself off mute. Mandy, we got a question here that I want to ask, where one of our listeners asks, has industry intervened to make acquisition processes more lax in ways that make outcomes like overpriced spare parts more likely?
I guess they have. Industry has worked with Congress to rewrite our acquisition laws. I almost hate to call it acquisition reform, because every time we have quote unquote acquisition reform, it seems like we just see costs go up and that the government is actually less empowered to be a smart buyer. But a number of these reforms we've seen, were literally written by defense contractors and the defense industry. In one case, it was changing a law, as I'm going to try and go wonky and then come right back out. So one of the issues is commercial buying. So truly commercial buying is wonderful for the government. There's a market that's setting the price and we know that it's fair and reasonable. The problem is that the government's definition of what is commercial is this kind of Alice in Wonderland thing, where actually the government's the only buyer and they're not able to get cost or pricing information to determine if something is fair or reasonable. In one case, a company was able to, again, tweak that definition that was successfully changed in the National Defense Authorization Act. Somehow their engine prices doubled the next year, and they'd said, well, we're not going to provide you cost or pricing information on it because it's a commercial item now, so you can't even challenge those kinds of overruns. And I think those are the examples that are really infuriating as a taxpayer, that we don't want to, complex weapon systems are challenging to control those costs, but we don't want to be spending too much for a pin. We don't want to be spending too much for a drain pipe. Like, these are kind of, own goals that we need to be preventing by having an acquisition system that actually works for taxpayers.
Well, so I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't ask a follow-up question about the audit, which of course is another priority that all of our organizations have worked on. And maybe you can kind of share with our listeners, the importance of the audit as you see it, or maybe the way it may not be helpful. I don't know. And sort of the related question of what steps, where Congress is moving with the audit, or what the sort of status currently of the audit is, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, so the good news is that the Department of Defense is actually starting to, they failed 3 audits, but they are at least getting into the process of being able to pass an audit. The bad news is they don't think they're going to pass until 2028. So we're a long way off. I think there were a number of people who have been skeptical of the audit process, that it's not sufficiently focused on specifically waste, but just making sure that we're able to account for the money that we have spent and, have like the documentation to back it up. But I think one of the things that's been really exciting about the audit is how it's actually having a lot of benefits that weren't initially expected. So some is, actually there are about $2 billion worth of equipment for the F-35 that we don't actually have documentation on to be sure that we know where it is. I think the Navy just recently said that they had identified, about $3 billion in transactions that they weren't sure about. And maybe even more importantly, the audit is really helping to make the department prioritize strengthening their IT systems and their cybersecurity to harden those systems against attacks. And even though we hear a lot of rhetoric about how important cybersecurity is, it continues to be one of the lowest priorities and one of the hardest things to actually harden and do. And I think Congress's support of the audit has really given those efforts the political capital they need to become priorities so that we can harden our systems so that we are protected against attacks.
Well, and I think we were talking with Senator Braun about the debt being an abstract thing. I think, especially for someone who's nothing close to a cyber expert or a tech expert like myself, cybersecurity is a very abstract thing until you have incidents like with the pipeline this week, where now you're seeing entire states running short on gas and runs on gas station because of a cybersecurity incident, and obviously the stakes are so much higher in DoD than they even are for for one pipeline. I want to, but I think that's a great sort of summary of sort of not only why DoD passing its audit is important in and of itself, but also has an impact on really all the other operations within the department. I want to turn to another issue that you and I have been working a lot on lately, Mandy, and that's efforts to push both Congress and Secretary Austin to pare back so-called wish lists from the service branches. For our listeners who may be uninitiated, Congress requires all the service branches and a number of other components within DoD to give them, it's a statutory requirement in law, to give them an annual unfunded priorities list. They've been called wish lists by media and by our organizations because what they end up being in practice is a way for the service branches and again other components of DoD to sort of do an end run around the Secretary of Defense and end run around the civilian leadership at DoD, and tell Congress, give Congress a list of other programs that they want funding for. And as our organizations have studied, often these lists, a number of items, if not more, on these lists get fulfilled to the tune of billions of dollars. I, as an advocate for fiscal responsibility, I'm particularly worried about these lists in a caps-free era where there are no longer discretionary spending caps, where we could see the wish list add even more to the tab on the defense budget. But Mandy, why is this effort to pare back wish lists important to you? What are some steps that Congress and or the administration could take to rein this practice in?
Yeah, and I'm so glad that NTU is going after this issue because I think it is one of the key drivers of increased Pentagon spending. I mean, fundamentally, what these wish lists do is it means that we have no budget discipline, that we're telling all of these services and components, you're going to get 2 bites at the apple. Don't worry if your priorities didn't make it in the first time around, you'll have another bite, and Congress is going to, try and find the money to be able to fund those priorities as well. So I think it's just one of many ways that we're not holding the Department of Defense accountable to the idea of, just have a modicum of budget discipline, just try and set some priorities. I would particularly, while it's important for Congress to be able to talk to the department and the components about where there might be unmet priorities, the problem with having this as a statutory requirement, and in some cases, we've even seen language that if you don't come up with a list of additional things, we're going to take money from your office. So that's really not setting up any kind of budget discipline. So the statutory requirement is particularly pernicious because it's automatically telling them, we actually really don't want you to set priorities. Or in some cases, what you kind of see is what's referred to as the Washington Monument Strategy, where you propose to cut things that are extremely popular. And so, which is frequently what ends up on these wish lists are the things that, then defense contractors are happy to run all around the hill to make sure that those are funded as priorities as well. So again, you're just not setting any kind of budget discipline process up. There is opportunity for Secretary Austin to at least ask for these services and components to brief him, as Secretary Gates did. We found that was really powerful in helping to discourage some of the worst excesses of those lists. I would like them to have to come up with offsets. So if these are your priorities, where would you like to take the money from your own budget, or hell, from other parts of the department? If you want to take money from the other services where you think your projects are more important, let's have that budget fight. Let's have a real discussion about setting priorities. But with this current process, it's a blank check.
You're proposing ideas near and dear to my own heart, not just in DoD, but I suppose across everywhere in government. I think we would be much better served if we had people at least thinking about the concept of offsets, and we could always decide that something is so important that it needs to be, we need to borrow, or we need to spend in an urgent way. But I think that shouldn't necessarily be the starting point for a lot of these things. And so I think you're right with respect to the wish list, that it would be really nice if people were sort of thinking about how you prioritize one item against another item. And unfortunately, that tends not to be the way of thinking. I want to ask a question that is maybe more theoretical, which is that it's really a question about the top line and in a sense, how much we should care about top line spending. But I'm curious also as to, we've been talking a lot about what really drives that top line. And, I've sort of always said that I think there are two competing theories of this. One is that, in essence, there's fat marbled into the Pentagon. There's sort of waste in these different areas that are, the programs themselves may not actually be inherently wasteful, but there are aspects of them that are conducive toward spending that may not ultimately be related to national defense. And I think the alternative viewpoint is that there are just things that the Pentagon is engaging in writ large that either because of foreign policy mandates, for example, exercises overseas maybe that may not make sense, or just generally engaging in whole scale programs that are just inherently wasteful. And so it's sort of the chop the fat off the steak kind of analogy. And so I wonder if you have a thought on that. I mean, the degree to which do both of these matter? To how do they compare to one another? What are the what is the real driver of sort of the increase in the top line that we've been seeing so much in the last, over the course of the last decade?
It's a great question. And at least on the latter theory, I do think we are asking the Department of Defense to do too many things. Senator Coburn had his Department of Everything report, going over all kinds of things that the Department of Defense does that has absolutely nothing to do with defense. And I'm certainly concerned, while that this is going to continue to happen, there are a number of things where Congress just goes to the Department of Defense to do them because that's where the money is, whether they're the appropriate agency to do that or not. So, healthcare research that really I think should be led by the NIH or someone else with the actual healthcare expertise, or HHS. I'm concerned about some of these climate change initiatives. Certainly the Department of Defense should be at the table and part of these conversations, particularly as they contribute to these problems, but they shouldn't be the ones in the lead. This isn't their area of expertise. And these are really expensive people to try and get spun up on how to do these kinds of things. In Afghanistan and Iraq, we were asking them to essentially be aid development officers. I think these are all things that this isn't what we should be using the military for. And it's a consequence of not adequately funding other agencies in a way that we should. If those are missions that are important to us as a nation, it shouldn't be only considered important if it's something that the Department of Defense is doing. But I think when you're looking at what some of the large drivers are, a lot of it is honestly just corruption in the system. So you have senior Pentagon officials going to work for defense contractors. You have these programs purposely having contracts with congressional districts across the country, whether that's actually a good, efficient supply chain or not, but it's very efficient politically to try and make a program too big to kill and too politically popular to kill. So I think all of these things contribute to the waste, and where you don't have people actually holding the department accountable. I think the Clinton administration did a lot to weaken the ability of the department to combat this waste as well by getting rid of a lot of oversight officials. My colleagues have been investigating proposed cuts to the Naval Audit Service as we're simultaneously looking at, building up our ships. I think this is extremely risky and dangerous, and it's going to not only waste money, but it's going to undermine our ability to actually build the kind of fleet that, is at least proposed in the National Defense Strategy. So I think there are a number of things that contribute to waste and that are preventable.
For sure, and it's obviously obviously a big part of this is the role that Congress has to play, right? And we our organizations all we talk about power of the purse issues, and I think broad 10,000 foot level, we see a lot of deference to this administration and to administrations past, to the Defense Department, to sort of set the table. Really, the only often where we see the most zealous congressional participation is in increasing the top line, right, and fulfilling these wish lists that we've talked about. I always point people to, there's literally a page on Lockheed Martin's website for the F-35 called Economic Impact, and it just shows it's all 50 states, and it shows how many direct jobs, how many indirect jobs. But to your point, Mandy, and you've done some great research on this that I've cited in a lot of my work. People get scared when you talk about the job creation and potentially losing jobs if you're cutting the defense budget. But the DoD is an inefficient job creator. There are more efficient ways. Some would argue both within government, if we're talking about, infrastructure investments versus DoD, and to maybe Jonathan and I, and you might agree or disagree with this perspective, Mandy, there are more efficient opportunities in the private sector to create jobs. But I'll get off my soapbox and transition to one of our attendees actually just pointed out, we can do a little bit of instant reaction to this, that I guess the House is not planning to take up their annual defense policy legislation, the National Defense Authorization Act, until at least September, according to leaders of the Armed Services Committee. We've been talking a lot, as a civil society community about the implications of the delay in President Biden's budget request and delays in congressional consideration of the NDAA. What are your thoughts on this, Mandy? And then Jonathan, certainly if you have any thoughts, curious to hear yours.
Unfortunately, I think it probably makes sense with just how delayed the budget is for Congress to have adequate time to review both the budget and different policy proposals. But it's bad. These are all things that are going to lead to a continuing resolution, which continues to weaken Congress's power. And again, when we look back at the Military Aviation Commission's investigation, one of the things that they cited as the largest problem is actually continuing resolutions, not the spending levels, but just that the department doesn't know what their resources are going to be and how that undermines planning. So I hope this is an aberration, and that we can get back to regular order on a number of these issues in the future.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, I think that the problem that we see so often now is that Congress is sort of losing its power vis-a-vis the executive, and the response over time in a number of areas has been to sort of centralize that power then that still exists in Congress in the hands of maybe a few people, and so you end up having leadership being much more powerful than it's been in the past. I mean, to some degree, obviously, it's pretty common for the budget of an incoming administration to take some time, so it's not too surprising. But yes, I mean, the less time that Congress gives itself to have these kinds of discussions, the less power they ultimately have, because they have to essentially go through this process really quickly, and they can't in that environment exercise adequate oversight. And this is a problem that goes, I think, beyond the defense budget, but it's in many ways it's very pronounced in the Pentagon space, because of the fact that the NDAA is one of those priorities that does have to happen every year, and it does happen every year. And so so I guess I would say my response is it's not too surprising, but it's like Mandy, I think it's unfortunate. I guess to that end, maybe we should talk a little bit more about the Biden budget and your thoughts, Mandy. I know Senator Braun was, maybe not a fan, it might be an understatement, but of course, I think he was thinking, broadly, about a number of priorities that he may have disagreed with. But I wonder, if you could share your perspective specifically on, the Pentagon portion of the Biden budget. I mean, I think there are a number of groups that have been, upset that, there was essentially an increase from the last administration, which had, significantly ramped up spending. And so, it honestly harkens back to a point that Senator Braun made, which is that both parties tend to be pretty much complicit in the constant increases in spending. But I wonder, what your reaction might be generally, if you would agree with that assessment, and, maybe if there are areas for optimism. We talked about OCO, maybe there are others that you might be willing to share.
Yeah, so initially it looked like it was going to be more promising because a number of very problematic programs were being put under review by the department, and at least with the announced potential that we're going to have like 85 F-35s, for example, that indicates to me that wasn't a very serious exercise, when I think this is a program that is in crisis and really needs to be addressed and held accountable. And that includes really slowing down production until we are able to fix the planes that we already have, until testing is complete. What we know so far as well is that there is going to be likely recommendations to retire quote unquote legacy systems. And I think that's always a complicated proposal. On the one hand, when the department wants to get rid of something, it's very tempting to be like, okay, let's do it. Let's get rid of it. But one of the things that I worry about is how it also introduces risk, because in a number of those cases, they want to retire systems that are working, for systems that don't, or that we don't know if they work yet or not. And it's really taking away the flexibility of the department to then hold that modernization program accountable if we've taken away, what we've had as capacity in the past. And if they're enduring missions, if there are still capabilities that we need to have, I do worry about some of those proposals to cut those systems are actually just further empowering more spending and less discipline down the road.
I think that's a really great point. I mean, my personal view on this, and I'd be curious to hear Andrew's thoughts on this too, is that, I think so much of the way that we should be approaching Pentagon spending is really thinking about what are the things that are going to put downward pressure on spending in the future, right? And with an eye, obviously, toward the most important thing, which is ensuring national security and that we're equipped to meet these threats. But I think that so often there's sort of this, you have this approach that is either continue these programs because we've always done them, or as you're pointing out, the flip side, which is let's get rid of these programs and replace them with something that is sort of untested, that may be great or may be appropriate for the future, but as we've seen with things like the F-35, could very well end up being a huge rabbit hole of just money being thrown down the drain. And so I think the framework you're outlining here is very smart, which is that you really do have to weigh these kinds of things and really think about what the implications are, not even just today, but down in the future.
Yeah, it's I go back to this example all the time. One of my favorite episodes of one of my favorite shows, Parks and Rec. You've got Pawnee needs to the city of Pawnee needs to cut its budget, and libertarian Ron Swanson is there in the front row with two little flags that say slash it, and he's chanting slash it. That can never be the approach, right? That's inefficient. And quite frankly, it plays into, with the defense budget, it plays into the hands of our ideological, the folks we disagree with on these matters, on the general matter of the Pentagon top line, because they can often paint folks who are advocating for a top line reduction, for a right-sized Pentagon budget, for a correction in sort of the historic levels of Pentagon spending. It gives the folks who disagree with us on all those an excuse to say, well, you're reckless. You're letting budgetary politics or you're letting rather than defense strategy determine your decision making. And that's never been it's been a challenge that I've reminded myself of. It's probably not a challenge that either of you need to make for yourselves anymore, given you've been working on these issues and doing good work for so long on them. But yeah, there has to be a strategy, behind efforts to reduce the Pentagon top line. It can't just be I'm not a big fan of across the board cuts. I'm not a big fan of I'm not even necessarily a big fan of setting some target cut level and then working up to that. I would rather we take a look at legacy programs, compare them, right? Because not every, as you the point you raised, Mandy, not every cutting, not cutting every legacy program doesn't, how do I want to put this? It is not necessarily the best decision to cut every legacy program, right? Even if that sounds good to budget hawks. I've been rambling enough, so I do want to talk though about one, and I want to get your thoughts before we wrap up the hour, Mandy, on one topic we've touched a little bit on, but I think is different than some of the legacy programs we've been considering because it's more future oriented and future looking, and that's the Navy shipbuilding plan. We saw an aggressive shipbuilding plan from the Navy in December of 2016 that would have them go from around 300 ships today to 355 over 10 or 15 years, I believe was the time horizon. We saw an even more aggressive proposal from the outgoing Trump administration in December 2020 that with an increase in manned ships along with a increase of I believe several hundred unmanned ships that the Navy wants to procure over the next 30 years, you'd see the fleet about double in size. I think was sort of the or more than double in size, if I'm remembering correctly. Your thoughts on the Navy shipbuilding plan, what questions Congress needs to answer before it considers greenlighting something like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredibly ambitious and incredibly risky. As I mentioned before, we're concerned that there are already cuts happening to the Naval Audit Service that would help to address some of the concerns about waste and fraud. But the Navy really does not have a good track record on its big modernization programs. You can look at the Ford aircraft carrier, $13 billion, not able to generate as many sorties as our previous carriers have been able to do. The Navy already getting rid of its littoral combat ships. That again, new program. We just bought this and we've already decided that we can't afford to keep operating this. So I think, especially if we don't have really strong oversight mechanisms in place, the Government Accountability Office has done a lot of great work on this, on Navy shipbuilding. And the Navy's continuing to accept ships that are deficient, that aren't meeting contract requirements. And my concern is, again, if you give them more money, the message you are sending is, we agree with your past performance, keep it up. And I don't think we want them to keep it up. I think we want them to significantly reform and be much better stewards of taxpayer dollars. But when we're buying ships, we want them to last. We want them to be able to have something that'll serve us for a long time in the future.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. And thank goodness to GAO, right? A 100-year anniversary coming up in July in 2 months. So very much a worthwhile taxpayer watchdog. I guess we're coming up toward the end, so I'll ask the last question, which is, I think it's very easy to be negative or sort of, pessimistic about the state of the Pentagon budget, particularly with, maybe the increases we saw in the most recent proposal. And so I wonder if you could speak for a few minutes about, where you're optimistic, where you think the opportunities for reform look particularly promising, and maybe where are the areas where we need to work even harder to kind of make some of these improvements going forward.
Yeah, I mean, even though it's going to take too long, I do have some optimism with the audit effort and how that's improving financial management and identifying a number of deficiencies and helping to prioritize cyber testing and hardening of some of these systems. I think we're probably looking at relatively flat budgets for the future. And I think that can be still a helpful forcing mechanism for the department to actually set priorities. But that's, as we know, that's not going to be easy for us to do. I'm also excited just about some of the things that are being done on the personnel side as well, about making sure that we increase diversity and making sure that we have a promotion system that's based on merit. And I think that can lead to better decision making as well if we can support those people to do so. So I think there are some areas for optimism.
And that is a great and sunny note to wrap up our conversation after an hour or 58 minutes of doom and gloom. So thank you, Mandy, for ending us on a high note, and thank you for all the work you do. To everyone who attended today, thanks so much. If you want to see a YouTube version of this webinar, we hope to have that up in the coming days. Please stay tuned for information about our June webinar, which will be the 6th in this series. Mandy, thank you so much for your time. Jonathan, thanks as always, and hope everyone has a great rest of their week.
Thank you all so much.